July 30th, 1975, mob boss Jimmy Hoffa disappears. Despite extensive searches by the FBI and the police, his body has never been found, and neither has the man himself. What happened? Did the Mafia kill Hoffa? Was he abducted by the CIA? Or is there another explanation for his vanishing entirely? Welcome back, everybody. Here's one of the most controversial men in American history. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa was going to meet two Mafia captains from Detroit at a restaurant called the Machis Red Fox. The meeting was to take place at 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, but when the two mobsters arrived, he wasn't there. In fact, nobody had seen Jimmy Hoffa since the previous day, so they reported him missing to the police. At first, they didn't think much of it. After all, Jimmy Hoffa was a notorious gangster, and there were many people who wanted him dead. But as the days went by, they began to get worried. Where could he be? And most importantly, what had happened to him? This is unexplained. We will look into everything from the evidence to the theories surrounding the case. And as always, we want you to make your own decision about what you think happened. We have a tendency to view gangsters as purely evil creatures who got what was coming to them. There's no denying that Jimmy Hoffa was a gangster, but hearing his life story makes him more human. He started out as a small-time hoodlum, but after seeing how much money there was to be made in the trucking business, he decided to move up in the world. However, he soon found himself in over his head. The Teamsters Union was a tough racket, and he needed all the help he could get. That's when he turned to the Mafia. They agreed to help him run the union in exchange for a cut of the profits. It was a perfect arrangement, or so Jimmy thought. In reality, he was just a pawn in the Mafia's game. He would do whatever they asked him to do without even knowing why. But then something happened that changed everything. Jimmy was arrested and sent to jail. Now the Mafia had to find a new frontman for the union. And if they were going to do that, they needed to get rid of Jimmy. That's why they put out a hit on him. The only question was, who was going to carry it out? For some reason, they chose Anthony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano, two of their most trusted men. Now, before we go any further, I want to tell you that these are not real names. I'm protecting my sources. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy left his home in Franklin, Detroit, around 2 p.m. His wife, Josephine, watched him drive away in his black 1975 Buick LeSabre. She knew that he was going to meet with the two Mafia captains, but she didn't know why. All she knew was that he was in danger. Little did she know that this was the last time she would ever see her husband alive. As Jimmy drove down the highway, he probably had no idea that he was being followed. Giacalone and Provenzano were tailing him in a blue Ford LTD. When Jimmy stopped at a gas station, they pulled in behind him. He never noticed them. As he filled up his car, they waited patiently in theirs. Then they followed him all the way to the Machis Red Fox restaurant. All the while, Jimmy had no idea that his life was hanging in the balance. When he arrived at the restaurant, Giacome's plan was to park down the street and wait for Provenzano to signal that he was ready to strike. However, this plan quickly fell apart when Provenzano accidentally honked his horn. Jimmy saw the blue Ford LTD and immediately became suspicious. He took off at high speed, but it was too late. Giacomo and Provenzano were on his trail. As Jimmy sped away from the restaurant, he turned onto a road near the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. It was here that his fate was sealed. Giacomo and Provenzano blocked him in from both sides and cut off his escape. Now, there are several versions of what happened next, but all of them agree on one thing: Jimmy was taken prisoner. Some say that the mobsters beat him up before taking him away. Others say that they shot him and left him for dead. But no one knows for sure. What we do know is that he was never seen again. The search for Jimmy Hoffa began immediately, but it was fruitless. The FBI and the police searched for weeks, but they couldn't find any trace of him. This was baffling to everyone involved. How could such a high-profile figure just disappear without a trace? One theory was that the Mafia had killed him and then hidden his body. If this was true, then they must have been very careful because they never left any evidence behind. Another theory was that Jimmy had gone into hiding. Maybe he had faked his own death so he could start a new life somewhere else. But this theory seemed unlikely. Why would he abandon his wife and family? Plus, he had nowhere to go. The Mafia would be looking for him everywhere. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure mounted on the Mafia. The media was having a field day with the story, and the public was demanding answers. The Mafia bosses knew that they had to come up with something, anything, to divert attention away from themselves. They decided that they would blame the Teamsters Union for Hoffa's disappearance. They claimed that he had stolen money from the union and then skipped town. But the Teamsters Union denied this, saying that he had taken money out of his own pocket. It was supposed to be a noble gesture. Apparently, he had planned to pay back the union with interest, but now they were blaming each other. And the truth was, none of them really cared about finding Jimmy. They had all profited from his disappearance. The higher-ups knew that the police would eventually catch the killers. And until then, they would use the blame game to protect themselves. But in reality, they were only protecting each other. Meanwhile, the FBI was hot on the trail. They believed that the Mafia was behind Hoffa's disappearance, but they didn't know where to start. That all changed when an informant came forward with information. He told the FBI that Giacomo and Provenzano had killed Hoffa on July 30th, 1975. They had lured him to the Macho's Red Fox restaurant under the pretense of discussing union business. But once he arrived, they had blocked him in with their cars and taken him away. They then drove him to a secluded area near the airport and executed him. With this new information, the FBI began to close in on the mobsters. They arrested Giacomo and Provenzano, along with several other members of the Mafia, but they never found any evidence to link them to Hoffa's death. All of the charges against them were eventually dropped. However, the FBI wasn't done yet. They still believed that the Mafia was behind Hoffa's disappearance. They just needed more evidence. A few years later, another informant came forward with information. He told the FBI that Hoffa's body was buried under the floor of a house in a suburb of Detroit. They dug up the floorboards, but they didn't find any bones. This led them to believe that the informant was lying. But what if he wasn't? What if Hoffa's body really was buried there? The problem was, they didn't know where to look. There were thousands of houses in the area, and they couldn't search every single one. That's when they got lucky. A construction worker came across a bone while digging a foundation. He alerted the police, and soon they were excavating a yard. They didn't find any bones. This continued until one of the dogs started barking frantically. The police followed the dog, and soon enough they found a skull. They also found several other bones. Could this be the missing mobster? They brought the bones to a lab where they were identified as belonging to Jimmy Hoffa. Finally, after all these years, they had solved the case. Or had they? The thing is, they still don't know what happened to him. Sure, they found his remains, but that doesn't mean they understand why he was killed. There are still those who believe that he was taken out by the Mafia, but there are also plenty of people who think that the government is behind his death. Supposedly, Jimmy was planning to expose the truth about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but before he could do so, he was silenced. This is why his body was never recovered. But there is no evidence to support this theory, and even if there was, why would the government bother silencing him? Couldn't they just ignore him? Well, maybe they could have, but they didn't, and now we may never know why. The death of Jimmy Hoffa remains one of the biggest mysteries in American history. What do you think happened to him? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing videos. Thanks for watching. See you next time.